In this video, I'm going to give a quick demonstration of how you can turn an ad that was created with an image or video and some text into an ad that now references the post ID of this same ad creative, so that it will look something like this, where now I am referencing this post ID and not the added in anymore, which makes it a lot easier to copy in the future, etc. So I'm going to show how to do this with Kitchen, and then how you can do this too. So here is my workflow that I have put together that does this, and I'm going to explain exactly how it works. So of course we're starting with an ad. I'm going to choose this single image ad, and I'm going to copy the ad ID from here. I've already selected my Kitchen demo account. I'm going to select ad ID. I guess it was already selected. Cool. So I have my ad selected now. What we're going to do now is we're going to get the ad details, so all of the ad information. We're going to extract the creative ID, then fetch all the creative information, and then inside the creative, there will be a parameter called effective object ID or something like that. So I'm just going to quickly run everything from here till here. So I'm going to set a breakpoint over here, and just going to click here, run from here. Cool. So now we went through these 4 steps. In particular, we fetch the ad, and in the ad object, as we can see, we have something called creative, and here we have the ID. And then we take out this ID, we extract it, looks like this, and then we need to convert it into a creative object, add creative ID object, so that our platform knows this is correct. So it basically looks like this, and then with a creative, we can now fetch the object creative information. So the creative information is like all kinds of stuff. Most of it we don't need right now. But what you can see is there's something called effective object story ID. And what you can see is that there is this first ID underscore and a second ID. And what this is this is the Facebook page ID, and this is the post ID. So this is effectively now exactly what we're looking for. So I can either do this manually now. I could now take this post, go back here, and now actually change and say, hey, I don't want to create an ad, but instead I want to use an existing post. I could do this now, or I can do this automatically by simply updating the ad creative with this new effective object story ID. How do I do that? Well, I need to create a new creative object. And the creative object, so in this case, I actually want to keep my URL tags. So I have URL tags, which are UTM parameter, but everything else from this creative, I don't need anymore. So basically all of the creative information, everything that you see is completely useless. The only thing that I need is the effective object story ID. This will contain everything else. And then what I also want is the URL tags, which, as you can see, these are my UTM parameters, etc. So this is important to me. So what I'm doing is I'm going to build an object that has something called object story ID and URL tags. And this object story ID is the parameter that we need to set when we're creating an ad with a post ID. Normally, and you can see this here, when we have an ad that doesn't have a post ID, we don't even have this parameter at all. We have a parameter called object story spec. And in this object story spec, we have the real information. So if I wanted to create an ad with just regular input that I want to be able to edit afterwards in Ads Manager or via API, then I'm going to do it this way with a page ID. I'm going to set all of this, the message text, etc. But if I want to have a post ID, I can basically swap out this object story spec and use object story ID and set this to the effective object story ID. So I'm using a patch node here. This is basically my empty object that I want to create. This is going to be my creative object, add creative object. I'm going to pass in all of my data here, and then I'm going to make two adjustments. One is I'm going to replace my object story ID with the effective object story ID from the add object that I just pulled. And then I'm going to replace the URL tags object with the URL tags from over here. Cool. So I'm just going to quick trigger this once manually. And there we go. So we now have object story ID, URL tags. And what we can do now is, in order to update the ad, I'm going to create now an object that basically looks like this. I'm going to do it quickly here as a demonstration. So in order to pass something to the update Facebook ad node, we basically need an object that takes in the ad ID like this, and then it needs to say type ad provider Facebook. So this is now a valid ad ID object. And so now what we can do is we can simply add these other parameters here. So in this case, we're going to update the creative parameter, and we're basically going to input this object that we just created. So this one, just going to copy paste it here just for demonstration's sake. Cool, and then it formats it nicely. So this is going to be the request that we're going to be making to the Facebook API. We're going to update the ad ID with this, the ad with this ID, and we're just going to update the creative parameter, nothing else, just the creative parameter with these two values. And cool. So the good thing is that I don't need to build this manually. I already have a valid ad ID object over here. And you may now think that this looks very, very different. And the reason for that is that we have this huge context, that we're just using to display something in the UI, etc. But if you look at it now, you can actually see that we have the ID up here, the provider up here, and the type ad. So this is exactly the same thing. So I'm going to use this as the basis of my new patch operation. So this is my basis. I'm going to pass in the new value that I had, the new object, the add creative object that I had here. I'm going to make another patch operation. So I'm going to add a new field called creative, and I'm going to pass in the whole value. So $input.value. So I'm going to pass in the whole value, and I'm going to trigger this once. And what comes out now, as you can see, again, feel free to ignore this part. I know it's a little bit in your face, but so we have an ID here. We have a provider here, we have a type, and we have our creative. And I'm just going to click run here. All right, there we are. So we're updated now. This whole automation went through. I'm going to delete this part. And what we can check now, let's see. Refresh our page. And we can already see it's in review now. And you can see that the ad setup is not changed. We're using an existing post. We have the exact same creative as before. We have our UTM parameters as before. We have our tracking as before. The only thing that changed was that we now have this post ID being used. So this now, this is it. This is the automation. We're going to take an ad, we get its attributes, extract the creative ID for the creative, pull the actual creative information. I'm going to remove the breakpoint here. So pull the creative information and then build this new object that has an object story ID from this value that Facebook shows as effective object story ID. So effective object story ID to object story ID, and replace this. And of course, you can use it either to update the original ad, or we could now create a new ad from this ad creative. Of course, this would also be possible, but I just chose to update this.